All right, thank you. I feel like, so this is, the theme of this session is the friendship between men and women, male-female friendships, in a much broader context also outside of marriage. And to my mind, it is perhaps the most difficult of all the sessions, certainly the ones I had to think through. And I think it might be good to give some of the reasons for that. One might think it is simply because some people are so touchy about the topic, you know, that when you say perhaps about women that they're generally more receptive and that men are more creative, that immediately both sides are up in arms, and therefore the only thing you do through such a topic is make enemies, and you create, as John sometimes says, much more heat than light. But I don't think it's only that. It's not just that it's a touchy subject, and in fact that's not the main reason. That's perhaps more a consequence. It's rather, for one, because the difference between male and female is a contingent difference, as philosophers like to say. There's no necessary essence, an eternal essence of femininity and masculinity, which even God could not have changed. Alice van Hildebrand, in this context, speaks of it as a divine invention, which I think is a very good phrase. It both says God is the one who made it, God is the one who created the difference, and then divine, of course, also means wonderful. It's divine in that other sense. It's a wonderful, enriching, delightful difference, the male and female difference. But what I want to stress here, and the reason it's a more difficult topic, is because it is contingent, harder to see, meaningful once you see it, but harder to see and to capture exactly. So I think, this is one reason why it's often reduced perhaps to the biological difference. That one is also contingent, could have been different. God created it, but it's easy to observe. You can just look at the body and see the obvious differences between them. Whereas this is a contingent essence that is spiritual, non-visible, and more than that, it takes different shape, different manifestation in different times and different cultures. So, and this, I think, is evidenced even in the text we read. It seems, to me at least, that some of the explanations, some of the examples, and so on, bespeak an earlier age, and a writer that would be more contemporary would, even if he had the very same insights, he would express them differently, and so that, I think, is part of the difficulty, and also one of the reasons I hope I can rely on you all a bit more, because if the text comes from an earlier culture, I from time to time feel that I am also from an earlier culture, not just different, being Dutch, but also when I read the things that particularly young people nowadays say and think and do and think is perfectly normal, then I wonder, do I really have my finger on the pulse of the contemporary situation? So all of that by way of preliminary observation. It's not going to be crystal clear, and I'm going to rely on your own participation in articulating and qualifying the various principles we're going to try to enunciate. That's not to say, and this will be the last preliminary point, that there aren't timeless principles, right? So I'm not denying that there are timeless principles at stake here. To say that the differences between male and female are concretized, influenced, take on different cultural expressions, is not to deny that there's some timeless principle that's being expressed in different ways. So, and it's that timeless difference, I think, that we want to try to understand and then perceive in the concrete context. Okay. So, now I'm just going to go through a few points in the book and at some point, or at several points, ask for your input and discussions. The first important point that Van Hildebrand makes is that the difference between male and female is not just a biological difference. It's not just the body and its urges that vary between men and women. And he gives one argument, one obvious argument for it, I think, and that is that, or rather, he prefaces the text with this point, because if that was the only difference, if the only difference between men and women were biological, had to do with sexual procreation, then the question of male-female complementarity and relationships outside of marriage would be moot, rather, right? There would be no sense asking it, because then all the meaning, all the significance of the difference would be appropriately lived out only in marriage, or at best manifest itself in the love that leads to marriage. So that's the reason he brings it up right at the beginning. But the point is much more important than that. The idea that the difference goes all the way through, you could say, the human person. You have, as he puts it at one point, two original types of person, different modes of personal being, each with their specific values, specific missions, and supplementary gifts. Right? So you see the difference there. It's obvious, but very fundamental and important, underlying the entire text. And that is often not seen, he says, because it is so typical, especially of modern thought, to think of the higher reality as a mere manifestation or refinement, an outgrowth of the lower reality. What we think of as spiritual really has its foundation and ultimate reality in some kind of physical difference. Physical reality is the ultimate reality. It's the thing that's really real, the thing that really explains everything else, and the rest is a kind of glow of that reality, an outgrowth, a flourishing of a different appearance of that reality, but it's not really real in and of itself. Van Hildebrand thinks this is a mistake, and here this is one way of showing that it is a mistake. And perhaps another point that he doesn't make explicit in this text, but again, one reason you might overlook the fact that the difference between male and female goes all the way through is a metaphysical difference, including the spiritual element, is again that the physical manifestations, the physical differences, are much more easily observed. And this, as John Henry pointed out to me just a few moments ago, is perhaps one of the reasons why the marriage debate and the reason why it has to be one man, one woman plays out so often on the level of the physical differences, sexual differences, and how they are important for procreation and so on. So the differences, what's emphasized in the debate is very often the biological, the bodily dimension. And one important reason to study this area in Van Hildebrand and others is to try to show that that's not the only difference. It's a very important one, but there is more to the differences and complementarity between men and women than just that if they get together they can assist in the creation of new persons. Yes? Good enough? Now, before he goes into the differences, Van Hildebrand highlights a few dangers that might tempt those who see and value the differences. And there are, I think, many more. You have come up with, but the two that he mentions that I find interesting and worth mentioning is one, that you might be so enamored by the differences that you overlook the essential sameness. That is to say, that men and women are both human beings or both human persons, and that in virtue of that sameness, they have the same ultimate calling. Right? There's no difference in the calling that all of us have, namely transformation in Christ and to live with Him and the other two persons, divine persons, forever. So the ultimate calling is the same. And he even mentions that apparently some people think that there's a different morality depending on the sex of a person. So that, for instance, his example, in some cultures, the demands that purity makes on a woman are more important than, or more strict than the demands purity makes on the male. And he thinks this is not just an exaggeration, but a falsehood. The demands of morality are the same and equally strict for both sexes. Another very interesting danger people might fall into, who again value the difference between male and female, is that they begin to deliberately pursue masculinity as such or femininity as such. Where I don't just live my life, out of, you could say, my own nature, but where I have in front of me an image of what it means to be male, and I try to deliberately model myself on that, try to deliberately attain masculine characteristics in my being and my acting and so on. And that is really one example of a more general problem, that there's a kind of artificiality in the conscious pursuing of things that ought to develop naturally. Right? So he thinks that the deliberate pursuit of masculinity by men or the deliberate pursuit of femininity by men usually leads to a kind of unnaturalness, an awkwardness, which is really counterproductive. These differences ought to reveal themselves naturally, organically. Any comments on that? Does that sit right?
I don't know. I feel like there's something about, because there's so many books on the feminine genius and being a man of God and these things. And I think there's an importance to that, to letting it develop naturally, but at the same time towards creating opportunities to grow in those ways and to learn what it means to be feminine. Especially in this day and age where there's so many attacks on true femininity or true masculinity. And so I think there's a lot of women who maybe feel a discord with what society's telling us is feminine based on what I'm feeling is feminine. And so, not to say that there are a lot of generalities, and if I don't want to put on a dress or I don't wear pants, like that shouldn't be part of it. But I think there is something good about pursuing something higher too.
I agree with that completely. I think, and I don't think it should be some sort of like force. Like I come up with this picture that I want to exactly match. I don't think that would allow things to develop naturally. But especially today in today's culture, I think you almost have to like invite yourself to explore maybe what it means.
Is it a degree issue? Are you saying that it's bad to turn these things, the pursuit of masculinity and femininity, into idols? Is it a degree? Is it a degree thing? Like, oh, this is, femininity. This is my goal. This is what I need to do. Yeah. Maybe I even become so passionate about it that I idolize it with that kind of unwittingly.
Let me hear some more things before I say anything and put my foot in it, John Henry.
Well, with the idea of like role models, it seems that there's a superficial and a profound way to be masculine or feminine. I could see how pursuing the superficial aspects would be have that air of artificiality. But it seems that if you say, I want to pursue, want to be friendly or something like that, to admire that kind of ineffable quality in someone else, and then try to emulate their the way that they live out their lives in different aspects. I mean, just not the characteristics, but how they live out within an actual person.
Yes. You go first, sorry. Jane?
Jane. I just think there's a difference in the time he wrote this compared to now. There was some great confusion now. Talking about new feminism and trying to rediscover it. It's something of our time. It's already been such an issue then, perhaps. Also, the way I read it was that what he was saying was that if you actively try and pursue, trying to be masculine or trying to be feminine, you can miss who you are.
Yeah.
In a sense, so that it's not about that per se, but just using it as a mask to, because you don't want to be who you really are, discover who you really are.
Yeah.
I guess this is a different issue, but I want to clarify like where he thinks the heart of the difference between sexes lies. I think
Let's table that, because if that's all right, because I'll come back to it, and otherwise I think we're sort of losing track entirely, unless you have a very important reason to insist on it now.
I think I sort of got you for real. You said something like there's some people that mistake to think this, that physical reality is the thing that's really real, and the rest is a sort of reflection of that reality. So that, I don't know, I guess I always more or less thought that the difference between sexes was sort of a outgrowth of the difference between male and female bodies that led to differences. So
Yeah, from Hildebrand, but again, hopefully it'll become clear later on, would say that the spiritual person as such already has a difference all its own, which perhaps even gets expressed in the body. So the idea that it's the body that causes all the differences, is the source of all the differences, that's the thing he thinks it needs to be challenged. So maybe the reason I think it's important to talk about this a little bit is because, for one thing, this organic development from one towards something is a general principle you find again and again in Van Hildebrand, the importance of things developing organically rather than being artificially pursued as an end. So it's not just here that you see that, you see it everywhere. And for instance, most of his spiritual writings, it comes up. He distinguishes between a kind of organic spirituality and a more artificial, willed, voluntaristic spirituality. But I can well understand the sort of the pushback that you're all giving to the idea, and at least in my view, one of the reasons, one thing that makes a big difference is if the idea is generally lost, if the culture has no sense of the difference, then people sort of feel there is a difference, but they don't know exactly how to express it, and so there's more need now for a kind of theoretical articulation of that and a kind of deliberate recovering of something that, if we lived in another time, would come naturally. You see what I mean? So I see, I think Van Hildebrand is entirely right. Would that we could just let it be and let it develop organically, but the facts of the matter are that if we just let it be, chances are the development won't be so great, and so we need a kind of external helps to achieve and even know how to live. And so does that make any sense? Does that cover it all, or am I still missing some important point? Yes?
Why is it important to develop organically?
We mentioned earlier last night that we were talking about the flower, remember?
Yes.
Alice van Hildebrand,
Yes.
excuse me, I'll fill you in. We were talking about one of the pieces of advice that Alice gave my wife when we were starting our courtship. Because I was such a piece of work, my wife needed a lot of advice. One of the gems she mentioned to my wife is this idea of that between two persons, in order to unite, achieve a certain communion with one another, there are various stages that need to be crossed. Persons begin at a distance. First you introduce yourself, then you find some things out, and then at least in Europe, you begin to say you in an informal way rather than the polite way, and so on. So there are various stages to be crossed, and the way Lily expressed that was by saying that, by using the analogy of a flower. A flower, you can see the bud. If you want to know what the bud is going to look like and whether it's going to be beautiful, and you open it up, you destroy the flower. So likewise, with friendship or a beautiful love, you have to have the patience to let the thing unfold organically, right? So that's one thing. But the other, sort of saying with the same analogy, I think there is something about if you want to make things happen artificially, using your will and your theory, what you get is perhaps more like a plastic flower than like a real flower. There is some artificiality that almost inevitably sets in. So
it's forced.
It's forced, exactly. That's what he means when he uses unnatural, awkward. And I think even people who know, I wish I knew how to be a man. I wish I knew how to be chivalrous, say. And they don't know. It's not in their upbringing, so they read something on it and they try it. Almost inevitably, they'll feel unnatural. And it will take lots of years of practicing it before it is a natural thing. So that would be one very important reason for the insistence on organic development.
Could it also be too? I mean, because I mentioned that I feel like we have a lot of women who probably feel something, a contradiction between who they're told to be and what they feel. That some of the work that's being done now to help recover that understanding is helping to clarify some of the things that are organic and natural. And so there are external realities to that help us to understand it, but there's really a clear clarification of our emotions and what feels almost unnatural on the opposite side.
Yeah.
That's just a thought.
Yes.
Okay, I'm confused, but
Oh no.
I agree with what you were saying, but then I was kind of thinking of Simone de Beauvoir when you were speaking about women, and I was trying to think of that quote she had, and I mean I don't understand her quote, and I know I don't agree with her teachings, but she said one is not born, but rather becomes a woman.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just sitting here trying to think like.
Yeah. So you know, the meaning of the quote is basically that the only difference between men and women is the physical one. But so bodily, biologically, we're different. But there's nothing else to gender. There isn't really a male, female person. Qua persons, we're all the same. We think the same, we know the same, we feel the same. It's just that some of these persons are in a female body, some are in a masculine body. And so if we could just change the body, we would be completely the same. And what makes for the difference, what makes for the gender difference, in the richer sense, is the cultural formation. So this is why some parents give lots of guns to their boys so they turn out to be proper men. And they give lots of pink things to their daughters so they turn out to be proper women. And so, right. And so you have both you have the attempt now to do without that and to give the guns to the girls, or at least to give them equally, maybe to give them both pink guns, and then that shoot flowers, and then and then you get and people are what they by nature are designed to be, namely persons in an asexual sense. So does that make sense? That I think is what Simone de Beauvoir holds and defends, and what has a huge amount of influence in the world today, and it is the thing that Van Hildebrand is trying to combat by saying no, the difference goes all the way through. It's not a social construct. It is influenced by culture, as I already said at the beginning, but there is a real difference that manifests itself in these different cultural expressions. No longer confused?
Can I just add one thing? I wonder if what's meant by letting it develop organically is the fact that when we talk about femininity and masculinity, it's not a cookie cutter. There's a range, just like there are generalities. There are some things that a female might portray that's a little bit what we say is masculine and vice versa. That doesn't make it wrong, but because each of us have our own value and characteristics, and what we're talking about, affinity to whatever earlier, we all, in our culture, in our families, and in our temperaments that we're born with, I feel like maybe the organic is growing out of who we are as individuals. Like, how does that femininity blossom in our individuality rather than becoming like this person who wears pink dresses? Like,
very good. That's a very important point, and part of the reason why organic development is so important. It's the only way in which the individual can express itself, because the model will necessarily be general, applied to many. Whereas if I'm an individual, as I am, with a unique vocation and calling and a unique identity, then my masculinity will be different from all other men. And that must come out myself. In fact, I myself can't even know it until it sort of comes out. Good, thank you. That's a very important added point. All right. All right, so then let's ask what are some of the differences that von Hildebrand discovers in men and women. And I think perhaps the best way of doing that is simply by reading just one paragraph where he goes through a few of them in very short order. In my edition, this one, it's page 107, and the one that was handed out it is 63, starting at the top of page 63. So here's what he says. It would lead too far here to enumerate all the details of the spiritual particularities of the feminine and the masculine person, the specific organic meld of heart and mind, of the affective and the intellectual centers in woman, the unity of her entire nature, the delicacy and receptivity of her whole being, the precedence of being as a personality over objective accomplishments, versus man's specific ability to emancipate the mind from all his vitality, the ability for pure objectivity, which predestines him for official positions, his specific suitability for efficacy and the accomplishments of objective works, his clarity, strength, and greatness. These differences mark the two sexes in their own peculiar nature. What about it? Another difference. Men get more grumpy when they're hungry. Good. See, this is why it's very touchy. It's makes me mad. No. Yes?
There's a related point, closely related to what von Hildebrand says in Max Scheler, where he says that man and woman have a very different relation to their bodies. He says man is related to his body like a dog on a leash, whereas woman lives her embodiment more integrally.
Yeah.
And I think that has a certain ring of truth, that lived embodiment, where body and spirit sticking somehow more naturally together in woman, where man living this intense life there in his mind, almost turns the body into an instrument for executing these projects and doesn't live as an embodied person. And it's related to what Hildebrand says there about the greater natural unity of woman, vulnerability, fragmentation.
Yeah. Yeah, I agreed. So, I mean, if you want to get at the sort of the eternal, timeless principles, what really is the difference? This might be one of the ways of putting it, that the feminine is characterized by a greater unity between body and soul, between heart and mind, in all sorts of ways that unity manifests itself. Whereas men are characterized by a greater ability, because I think it's a real ability too. They're not just fragmented, that would be a negative way of putting it. The ability to separate, to use one capacity, one faculty sort of on its own without bringing in the others, and therefore achieve a kind of greater objectivity. So I wish I could put that in one word. Unity is such a nice one word, but it seems to me there's one timeless difference that, again, gets expressed in all sorts of ways.
Well, I think neuroscience has shown that's true now, isn't it?
Who does?
Modern neuroscience has confirmed these
Modern
things.
what?
Neuroscience.
Oh.
Studies of the brain have shown that women have a greater connectivity between her intellectual part of the brain and her emotions, and that men don't have this. So it's much easier for women to identify and express her feelings. Because man's less connected, he's got this greater ability to detach. So everything that Hildebrand was saying is actually these. I think doctors in the room can confirm it, but it's actually how we're actually wired, physiologically.
Yeah, although Hildebrand wouldn't say that's why.
No.
It
What
might
I'm
be,
saying is
yeah,
it's expressed on
it
that
is
level
expressed
as
on
well.
that level as well.
So
Yeah.
if you think that soul is a form of the body,
Yeah.
and it's expressing it sort of through
Yeah.
your physiological reality, your body, everything. It's what's actually going on in the deep.
Yeah. What about another timeless principle? If you have to get to the essence of what was said here in these various characteristics, unity versus ability to separate. What page was I on?
107.
107. Another thing that's often said, and I think again with lots of justification, is this distinction between receptivity and creativity or activity. Who would be the receptive and who would be the creative? I suspect all of you would say women are the receptive, men are the creative. So I think there is a certain plausibility there, not just plausibility, a real insight into the difference between the male and the female. Yes?
I was just wondering if kind of engendering creativity in others, would that be considered a creative act, or would that be being receptive to kind of their qualities and allowing them to flourish?
In the context of this article, I would think that maybe has a lot to do with the mission that particularly perhaps women have towards men. That is this kind of fecundating effect. And this you find, of course, often in the history of things, that some woman is the inspiration very often behind a great work of art or some other thing. So, and mothers and their children, again, fathers can also be a source or fecundate their children in this way, but it seems to be more typical, more expressive of the particularly feminine mode of personality. So perhaps the answer then in short would be, I think it is both this ability to elicit from a person seems to me to be a more feminine quality, and because it requires a kind of interest in the unique individual, a kind of talent of nourishing that individual in his uniqueness, and then but also it is precisely this interaction. It's the complementarity between men and women in action. Yeah.
So it's something I can't remember now if it's in Alice and Hildebrand or in this essay, but something really Alice often distinguishes is between the man's tendency towards abstraction and the woman's preoccupation with the concrete. So in some ways it goes towards the unity and difference aspect, but it goes in other directions, and it also strikes me in some ways as, at least in my own experience, to be very plausible. And, for example, these are stereotypical examples, but she likes to ask, if you were to put a man in a room with a baby and a computer, where would the man go? I'd like to think we'd go to the baby, especially if the baby needed us, but there's a fairly good chance we could find this computer quite interesting. That's her example.
She underestimates us. Maybe.
Well, just go to
maybe I should find another place for her to live in the summer. I'll find my own weaknesses in all our books pretty soon. Now, don't start reading our books trying to find out where she's talking about me or anything. All right, so again, much more could be said about that. I think those two are very key principles. Perhaps one more. Very often, and you find this in, particularly in trying to figure out what exactly the place is, what a relation is between husband and wife. There have been throughout the tradition many ways of trying to articulate that in terms of roles. And even though I don't like the talk of roles very much, the ideas of the terms that the woman is somehow the heart of the home, and the husband more the head of the home, or even the term husband itself, the husbanding livestock, I think is where it comes from, the kind of care, and but the whole focus of that care is so that the animals thrive. So in a similar way, husband, the mission of the husband is to make the family thrive, the family of which the wife is in one way or another the center, the heart, the fire. So, but again, it's only another one that's often used is and it's mentioned by Van Hildebrand, the difference between being and having, where the whole idea of being is more characteristic of the feminine, having is more characteristic of male personhood. I think that one's perhaps a little less satisfactory, but it's certainly worth pondering. And maybe, again, I should say, all of these differences have to always be painted keeping in mind the higher truth, in a certain sense, that we're all persons. So men are also, of course, called to be receptive. Men also should be able to listen sympathetically, just like women should be able to be objective, and so on. So in some ways it is a universal call that we all have, but that gets distilled in a greater way in one, or it gets thickened in one sex rather than the other when we're talking about the strengths and weaknesses or nature and contrasting qualities of both sexes. Yes, John?
Just one reference that may be of interest to people. The wonderful papers of Edith Stein on woman covers exactly the ground that Van Hildebrand covers, the contrast between masculine and feminine, the one that you read. That's a rich source for going deeper into these signature marks of man and woman. And another such source are these addresses of John Paul on the genius of woman. That also probes just these differences that we're talking about.
Is that what they're called?
And they're published under the title
The Genius of Women, and Man and Woman is the title of Edith Stein's
On Woman.
On Woman.
Each, yeah.
So for those,
Just to add to that, Pope Benedict's address to the Roman Curia of Christmas 2012, he talks a lot about gender ideology, and quite succinct, but a really wonderful read on that kind of line. Pope Benedict's address to the Roman Curia of 2012, Christmas 2012.
yes.
I think this may also relate. I became interested in the genesis or origin of the name Father. You know, what does that mean and where does it come from? And I think one of the things you discover is that it has a meaning of one who initiates love, which might fit into our discussion. I don't know if anyone else has run with that question.
First time I hear it.
I just made it up.
It's slightly surprising because, if anything, I think I've heard, is it in John Paul II, this identification of the vocation to love is especially characteristic of women, making love more central, love between persons in the world. And so
The key word is
initiation, yes. So I'd have to, and of course it maybe goes a little bit along with that idea of creativity versus receptivity and so on. Just would want to think through exactly how to formulate it without getting killed. So those are some of the differences. Again, it's a huge topic, and I'm glad you mentioned some of the sources so we can go to it with greater, some more discipline and precision. But then Van Hildebrand talks about the mission that men and women have towards each other, or the complementarity. And he distinguishes between the negative mission, that is to say, each sex has a kind of task to compensate, as he puts it, for the dangers or the weaknesses in the other sex. So several things he mentions. One is simply the necessity that is created by this difference to adjust our perspective, to place ourselves in the perspective of a woman as a man, or into the perspective of a man as a woman. That is already a very ennobling and a beneficial result of this male-female difference. And we saw this also in Wojtyła, how important it is for the woman to have some insight into the male psychology, to be able to understand how to behave and so on. And of course the same thing is true vice versa. So there's that. The necessity to adjust is in and of itself already a good thing, but it's a negative one. Or he talks about the curtailment of inimical tendencies, the curtailments of bad tendencies in the nature of each when they are isolated from the other sex. Here all you have to do is think of the language of sailors to see what he means. It's this: when men are together for so long without any feminine influence, then they begin to speak in a certain way that's really not only not for the ears of women, but it's really not properly human. So you could say there's a kind of humanizing influence, a civilizing influence that women have over men, or typical the ruthlessness, a certain coarseness in men. And similarly, the male sex has perhaps the influence of looking at things more objectively, not getting too sentimental or things like that on the feminine. All right, so those are some of the negative ways compensating for weaknesses. That's part of the mission. But the more positive mission that Van Hildebrand wants to point out is that there is a unique capacity that the sexes have towards one another, of stimulating and this mutual fecundation. And there again, I wish I was a poet and then I could describe it wonderfully and exactly. But there is a way in which chivalry, for instance, a kind of courteous, respectful attitude of men towards women brings out depths and beauties in the feminine sex that otherwise wouldn't come out. And also that chivalry itself is already something positive in the men, brought out by women. So when Hildebrand talks about self-control, a certain humility, a certain purity or softening of the male nature that is brought out because of the fecundating, fructifying presence of the feminine sex. Yes, sister.
Just regarding that, I guess I was just struck where he says, it's on page 64 in this section where you're talking about the missions, where he speaks of a woman will never be as deeply understood by a woman as she could be understood by a man and vice versa. I just find that rather interesting. Any comment on that? Or?
Yeah, that was going to be my next
I'm sorry.
my next point, that besides this fecundating effect that they have on one another, Van Hildebrand is also convinced that because the sexes they're not just different, but they are ordained towards one another. They're made to fit, so to speak. Again, this is very obvious, of course, on a bodily level, but this is also true on a more spiritual level. It's true all the way from about the mode of personhood, and so he thinks there is a unique interpenetration of souls that is possible because of the complementarity of the sexes. Right? That's what you meant, but you wanted me to say more about that.
Well, because I think in general we hear, men never understanding women.
Yes.
Women, you can't understand a man. So, he's saying something directly contrary to, I think, what many people understand from experience.
Yes.
So I'm just interested in, I just find it interesting what he's saying there, is that really a woman is better understood by a man, and yet in experience most of our sayings are just the opposite.
Yes. And that was my question too, and I find it very frustrating that he didn't ask it. Right? Because there is this, men are from Mars and women are from Venus, and the two never really meet and can't communicate. I think both are present in experience, and I think what Van Hildebrand says is the more authentic, the deeper truth. When men and women sort of take the time to sit down and understand one another, I think it's a kind of experience from a distance. When a man says women, but when he knows a woman and listens, then there is a kind of understanding, first of all, that of the differences, but then also a deeper understanding than would be possible between two women. And there again, I was thinking to myself, but so often, speaking totally from my own experience, because as I say, I think we're sort of thrown back on our own experience much more here than in other topics. And there are so many times when there's something happens, some development in the family, or some happening, or I don't know. And my wife and I talk about it. We discuss it, and it's great, and we understand one another, but very often afterwards she picks up the phone and calls a friend, and it's usually a female friend. In fact, it's always a female friend. So you can ask yourself, is that where she really feels understood? It's not funny at all. These are deep marital crisis. But I do think that when you think it through, no, it's not that. There is something that is added by this female friend that I can't give, right? Which is, I think that's also part of the general experience. But it's not it's not a deeper understanding. I think there still is, I guess there still is a deeper understanding between she and me that's not duplicated, or that's not matched by anyone else. And so I, at least in my experience, there is this deep truth that, and of course it is then philosophically made understandable in terms of this complementarity, that if the two are ordained towards one another, then it only makes sense. This experience only makes sense, that a husband and wife share a kind of mutual understanding. It's what they share, that what draws them together, what builds their communion is not just the sexual sphere, but also that deep spiritual union which is only possible between them, in part because they are made of different kinds of persons, male and female.
Could I just take it a step there, because it's interesting. I mean, I see what you're saying in terms of with marriage, but here he's also saying he seems to be applying it even outside of
Yes,
marriage.
he is. Of course.
Because in the marriage, yes, I would see that, but
Yes.
even outside, which would make sense with the complementarity in some way. And I
Yeah.
understand what he's saying, but I would like to hear him draw it out a
Yeah,
little more.
me too. He gives examples, but then you have to know these examples pretty well. And it doesn't, a brief biography, of a couple of pages usually doesn't do to really bring home the closeness of the friendship and a real sense for the uniqueness of the friendship between some of the saints he mentioned. So, to me, those examples aren't particularly helpful because I just don't know them well enough. In fact, I was going to give my own example between John Henry Newman and St. John. And then all of a sudden I realized, but these are two men. It doesn't work. Yeah, so I shouldn't have mentioned that, because now maybe there's going to be some more confusion.
I was going to say, could it be just that, like when we say most understood, or however he phrases it, I think, at least in my experience, with like female friendships, there's a type of like, it's not commiserating, but it's sort of like an understanding because we are the same.
Yeah.
But there's also that, I think if there's like a barrier to truly, we almost can't understand ourselves. It's like that element of the fact that a man is not a woman, and therefore it's like a third party view that I think it is like a depth of understanding that is different because you almost can't understand.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, it does make sense, except I wouldn't say third party, because that gives the idea of a kind of objective external look, which is also very helpful to help us understand ourselves. In this case, it seems to be more a question of, it's sort of the key that unlocks, and you can't unlock two keys. You need the keyhole to. That's what matches. But that's a good point. That if I understand you correctly, the reason men talk to men and women talk to women very often, and why they get something out of it that they wouldn't get by talking to one another, is because there's a kind of solidarity and understanding precisely based on their similarity. And what from Hildebrand wants to point out is that there's also a type of understanding which is really a deeper understanding, which is based precisely on difference. Yes. I'm not keeping track of fingers and when they go up, so please, maybe somebody else can do that. Yeah. Or you can just
laugh me off the stage.
No. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think, there is a solidarity, so women talk to each other, but I also like to add, this is just based on what I've observed and what my experience too, that when you talk to other women, you know you're going to be listened to, and they're not always going to try to give you a solution to your problem. And I think with men is when I talk to my guy friends when I'm looking for solutions, when I can't see something and I need some sort of insight. And so I think we see different pieces of the puzzle, and together we make the puzzle.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very. But part of the difference there, I think, reveals the difference again between masculinity and femininity. The fact that if you want to be listened to, you go to a woman, whereas if you want a solution, a practical solution, you go to a man. That and I think that's not only true of you when you want something, also true of the men. If men want someone to listen to them, they go to a woman, and if they need a solution, they go to a man. And so I think that really speaks much more to the difference, but that.
In a deeper way, I think it is like being understood, because
Yeah.
yeah, I would say a man does understand more. No, like, well, for me as a woman, the complementary, like, yeah, like it is for a man and a woman, it's for a woman and.
Yeah. And it is perhaps for, I'm just thinking of it now, that for the man he has to overcome this kind of practical tendency, objectifying tendency, this tendency to go to the computer rather than to the child, because of course the understanding presupposes that he first sits down and listens. You know, that you need to, and that may be more difficult for men
And what
than
you
for
mean
women.
by understanding, like if by understanding you advance, then you would need that kind of solution thing and that listening.
Yeah.
Versus just feeling like someone understands what you're saying.
Yeah. Maria, you have been wanting to say something.
I have to say, I thought of something far more fundamental. I mean, in the sense of not now, because I completely agree being married, that there can be often miscommunications and you wonder how does he not understand. But that this is something far more fundamental. So for example, it strikes me that Adam actually didn't understand his being until Eve was created. So somehow Eve helped Adam to understand who he was as a man, and he helped her to understand who she was as a woman. So somehow that kind of, it seems to me that the way that, I mean, I from my personal experience again, that somehow I see how with my husband, I mean, much more than I would say his male friends, you know, there's a vision that I have of, you know, who he is as a man, who he is also as a father, who he is in his role, in his masculine role, and vice versa, so that there's that kind of mutual calling on. And I think that that's why sometimes these spiritual friendships, of course, can be so rich, because you know, whereas with women, I mean, I don't know if it's just because we don't focus on it so much, but I think that's precisely also because we bring it out in each other. That so if I have, you know, a spiritual director, or, you know, I mean, if you have somehow that complementarity also in such a role, that they can really see something far more clearly, you know, in you than you might be able to, than other women might be able to. So,
Thank you. You should have been here. That is much more fundamental, therefore more important. Did everybody write that down? Just make sure you give proper credit. And I think that's very well said. They're not just little differences. We understand ourselves better in our own vocation as men and women under the influence of the other. Now, we tend to, at least I tend to automatically go to marriage to illuminate this complementarity between the sexes, but of course the whole point of the essay is to precisely stay away from that, to show that this is also possible apart from marriage. And there, Van Hildebrand gives various examples of non-married people who have this deep, as he says, ardent and very close friendship, and this is the closest of these, the most excellent of these, are between men and women. And again, he gives a whole list of examples hopefully you're familiar with some of them to get some sense of what he means. But then that raises immediately the question of, is this really possible? Is a platonic relation between the sexes of that nature possible? Okay, that we can be students together, that we can go on, I don't know, outings together and so on. That's one thing. That we can be in the same soccer team. That all of that is one. But these deep, ardent, intimate friendships between two people of a different sex, a man and a woman, that yet is not married. Is that possible without the sexual element coming in at all? And when I thought of this, I immediately had to watch, what's that old movie? When Harry Met Sally, which is all about this theme, but it didn't give me all that much light. And then I read some other articles, and they also didn't give me so much light. So the point is, here's why the question is important, I think, to Van Hildebrand. At least some reasons why the question is important. If Freud is right, say, that this intimacy really, this friendship between men and women really is just a manifestation of repressed sexuality, that really it is sexual desire sort of hiding itself and taking on another form, then, of course, these friendships are really an illusion. They're not really what they pretend to be, what maybe even the two people involved think they are. Or, if it's not an illusion, if the sexual element necessarily comes in consciously, then you could say such friendships, which do not lead to marriage, would be essentially disordered, because we're talking about sex in the physical sense, which is ordained for and has a meaningful place only in marriage. So the question is, that sexual tension, which is typical of conjugal love, can that or can it not be completely excluded? If it cannot be, then I think, in Hildebrand's case, that there is a deep mutual understanding between men and women that's spiritual, precisely, and not necessarily bodily or sexual. His case is terribly weakened. But he says it is possible. And how does he say it's possible? When is it possible? Anyone pick up the reason? Yes. Was that illuminating? That's exactly what he says. That these special bonds, these unique bonds of love between two people that are not married of the opposite sex, can be free from that sexuality only if they are lived in and through Jesus. Basically, when the salvation of the other person is the uppermost in my mind. I really don't know what to make of that. I don't know if you... It seems to me there must be more... there must be deep friendships that are not illusory, that are not stained by sexuality, that don't have this explicit reference to Jesus, to Christianity. But I don't know. Do you have any? I'm looking at people who know more than I do on the topic.
It seems to me that there would, in a non-Christian context, there would still have to be a great degree of personal virtue.
Yes.
And the ability to somehow sense that the sexual dimension would not be in the best interest, obviously, of this non-marital relationship. But with virtue, obviously, I mean, because it would seem, because the question, I suppose, is to what extent does the sexual dimension not almost inevitably creep in?
Yeah. And he makes
as an idea, for example, a thought.
Yeah, and he makes the interesting distinction, I think a very important one, that the sexual element can creep in all relations. But he says in most cases that's sort of accidental. It's a danger, you have to be alert, and you just banish it. But in these intimate and ardent relationships between a man and a woman that are not within marriage. There, in some ways, the sexual element would arise from the nature of the love itself, having to do precisely with the love. So it's not a danger that comes from without, an accidental danger that can come at any moment, but there's something inherent in the dynamic of the friendship, he seems to imply, and therefore it plays a different role as a danger, and perhaps that's why he so quickly goes to the need for Jesus to be there, and the explicit focus on the salvation of the other. I think you were first, no?
Well, I just wanted to reference back to a quote from the marriage. I'm not going to find it right now, but I noticed in the marriage book he makes a comment about how love, the conjugal love, is not friendship plus that sexual, that he actually uses I forget what word, he uses a very negative word.
Yeah.
That would be like
repugnant, I think he said.
Yeah, and I just find that interesting that he says that and then comparing it back to this. Not really a point, just the reference of that conjugal isn't, and I wonder if that has some implication on what he's trying to compare, vice versa.
I don't see.
Because when I first read the quote in the marriage, I thought, well, because why couldn't a really good friendship, a deep spiritual friendship, eventually manifest itself into a potential spousal relationship? Is it impossible that could if the conditions were right for it?
I mean, I think the purpose of or at least the context in which he says it in the book, is to show that friendship love and conjugal love, they are essentially different kinds of love. So that there is something in the essence of conjugal love to include the sexual sphere, and also this drive or the longing for exclusivity and so on. There are many characteristics that could be mentioned which are not true of friendship in the ordinary sense. And so what he wants to say there is it's a mistake to think that married people are simply good friends, add sex, and like friends with benefits. Apparently, my wife told me there's some movie like that. That's not what he wants to emphasize. The unique love that conjugal love is, and that's and why it is fitting, therefore, that marriage sort of is the natural fulfillment of that love, whereas marriage is not the natural fulfillment of friendship. So, but how exactly it applies here, there's probably some way it doesn't occur to me at the moment. John?
Do you think he's talking about a friendship between man and woman, this love in Jesus in which he speaks? It sounds almost like a kind of spousal relation that has no sexual dimension to it, and is therefore not exactly friendship. I mean, these are unmarried saints in his example. Right? The language in the quotes, is a very spousal ring to it. So it seems to be a very exceptional kind of case where a kind of spousal love with no sexual dimension, no sexual consummation exists thanks to the strong religious commitment that both bring to it. But I'd like to see also discussed, and I wish he had given more attention to the case of simple friendship.
Yeah.
Where we're clearly in the category of friendship, and where the friendship has a very distinct color because it's between a man and a woman.
Yeah.
That's a very real, rich reality.
Yeah.
Man-woman relations. He's right that it doesn't have to involve sexuality.
Yeah.
And it shows, that the man-woman complementarity is more than just physical.
Yeah.
But it didn't get as much attention as this extraordinary case that it reaches.
Yeah. So it's a new thought to me that it wouldn't be friendship, the high ideals that he mentions. I'll have to reread it. He doesn't explicitly say one way or the other. You find
No, I don't know. I'm interpreting that way. He must be.
And you're right. I think about this. To me, this would be the most interesting part of it, and it comes at the very end in just a few pages. So I don't know what he would have said about it, but I'd love to hear if you have any developments. Yes, excuse me.
Yeah, one thing about that, about examples in friendship. I mean, for Francis de Sales, I know what marks for Francis de Sales in Introduction to About Life. What marks friendship is communication. That is a sharing in goods together, and the more perfect the friendship, the higher the goods that you're sharing. And so I'm thinking about the example he uses with St. Jane Frances de Chantal between himself and the letters. Clearly there's a tenderness and a real ardor of affection, but also a sharing in God together, and a growing in a common mission. It seems that what comes. The question I had about this is, we have these examples of what you said. I also have this question: is it a kind of spiritual spousal love? And then the question is it incompatible for this saint to have it with another person besides this one close friend? Because friendship, by nature, is open to a third and a fourth, and is open to more. Whereas spousal love does have that desire for that exclusivity, and wouldn't want to invite another into this. So I have a question of whether it would be unfaithful for Francis to have de Sales have another. So, I mean, you know what I mean? Another very close woman friend who he's also.
That would be a good way of testing the question.
In this kind of
there was that
close,
openness,
intimate correspondence, but then, I mean, and then there's that quote from Bernard of Clairvaux, the Countess Ermengarde, which is rich and filled with this emotion and affection. But if there is that element of like this can't be shared with another person at the same time, and there's this spousal dimension, but then I wonder if because we're talking about a kind of living the eschaton already, I mean, living the virginity, and John Paul II talks about how we will be, I mean, he really takes a strong position that we will be raised from the dead as male and female, but the true meaning of the sexual difference will be different than it is in this world. And that it will take on a new meaning and actually reveal the communion of persons and make possible the communion of persons in a new way. He never goes so far as to say there will be sexual relationships as we know them here. I mean, because it will be completely satisfied with God. And so what he says is there's the virginal meaning of the body makes, in John Paul II's anthropology, like reveals the full meaning of the spousal meaning of the body. And I wonder if that's true. I just wonder if maybe this openness as a man, as for Francis de Sales to give himself to God completely, would allow for an openness to a kind of communication which would not have that exclusive spousal dimension that could be shared, but also can only be shared uniquely between someone of the opposite sex, and that's what is gotten at here. There's a way in which even a spiritual friendship between two men can't go places that a spiritual friendship between a man and a woman can go. That's a lot, but
well, unless somebody wants to respond, do you want to say something? I have to just take it in. I'm out of my depth here, so.
Yeah, I mean, to respond to that, I think that this whole week I've kind of been interested in the things that Hildebrand has left out that everyone has kind of wondered why, that certainly he considered, we would think, and that maybe in this situation he leads the topic just to the Jesus kind of centered discussion, maybe for cultural reasons, or maybe he was, didn't have a good understanding or a good personal example to draw from of a platonic relationship outside of marriage between a man and a woman. but I found it interesting that he does leave Jesus as the central point, so that with that as the center, especially like you're saying in the context of chastity and virginity, that it kind of opens up a new opportunity. But that within people who are married, it seems to be a totally different kind of topic. It's a totally different type of topic, and perhaps it's, you know, I don't know, maybe it was left out for a reason. What do you guys think of that?
Thanks for, shifting the discussion a little bit. I'm going to give some priority now to questions that address the other, the more broader role of not so much the mystical friendships that in some ways really are, I think, central to his own piece, and to the other one, which has to do simply with ordinary friendships, relations between men and women as you'd find it here on campus, or in the workplace, or so on. He has a few things to say about it. There's he's talking about the danger of blunting. If the well, it'll come out in the discussion, the danger of blunting. And then there's also, he says a little bit about the mission of the sexes, but not all that much. He talks about the dangers there too, or the abuses of it, that there, for instance, shouldn't be any rough and ready comradeship. There ought to be a certain awareness of the other sex, and particularly perhaps on the part of the men, a kind of reverence for the mystery that femininity represent, and therefore there shouldn't be a letting go of oneself. There should never be a letting go of oneself, and should always sort of be self-governed, of course, but particularly in the presence of mixed company, there is an extra call, and it's the presence of the other sex that awakens that need to be more. What's the opposite of letting go? To be more, not exactly on guard, but reserved, recollected. That's a good term. Sort of, yeah. So, are there any questions or comments on that aspect? Yes.
Well, I don't know if you didn't mention it here, but it reminded me of the value response involved, and I guess the way that I'm thinking about it is people always talk about having boundaries in relationships, like look after sex, and it makes sense to me in the sense of like guarding against a certain level of intimacy, because like if I'm to sit here and just pour out my heart to a male friend and show him all of my emotional value, like that's almost prompting him to respond. Like the value response to that would be to love that in a way that maybe would not be appropriate for so there's like some sort of boundary, almost not that you need it, not that that's not valuable to share, precisely because it is so valuable that to offer that would almost incite a value response that would be inappropriate.
Not proper to the mere friendship.
Yeah.
That exists between.
I don't know if that would fit in, but that's how it would make sense.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. Is that what you said? Reserve? You mentioned something. Yeah. So I think that there ought to be a greater attention paid to what you share, what you just sort of say when there's just men around or when there's just women around, and also what you would say to women that you know relatively well but not great, and what you know to men that you know equally well. There's still a difference there. Certain things you say to one sex and not to the other, and that seems to be a proper way of paying respect, of taking into account these differences. Yes, John.
Do you think perhaps we should take a break and resume with this conversation?
Sure.
But